So just to start and to get us into the headspace of thinking about home, I was wondering on your handouts there, if you could just jot down what home means to you.
Safe.
Safe, it's safe, yes. Sue?
Somewhere I can do what I want to do without being told.
Somewhere I can do what I want to do without being told I can't. Okay, it's a very important point. Other thoughts about home? Privacy. Now, so you can lock people out that you don't want in, close the door, and even not answer it if you don't want it. Right. Comfort, you feel comfortable. Space. So usually when we look for a home, we might look for the type of space that we need, and also physically and also from others. Yeah.
My family lives there.
My family, you're surrounded by family or people that you love.
Share with friends.
Share with your friends. A place that you control and can have your own decisions, routines, preferences, tastes, choices, your own choices.
Cleaning and maintenance.
Cleaning and maintenance. Well, this is really it's interesting, isn't it? Because everybody has their own standard around cleanliness and maintenance. That's important to some people. And when people interrupt that, like if you're a really clean person and other people are messy, it can drive you crazy. And alternatively, if people are really clean and you just like things a bit more relaxed, that can be annoying too. A place where you can be yourself. Yeah, that's a really good point, isn't it? That you have neighbours around you. Yeah. I had a neighbour the other day. Our sort of back doors, like you can see each other from it, which is a bit sort of weird sometimes. And I was sitting at my kitchen table and he yelled out and he said, "Deb, is your power on?" And anyhow, I went to the door and here he is, like in a towel. And I was like, whoa. Anyhow, all the power had gone off and he couldn't get in his gates because they were electronic, and he tried to climb the fence and almost impaled himself and was bleeding. So that sense of neighbours, right, can be really important sometimes. Information, also for safety if something goes wrong. Yeah. Any other thoughts?
Loving environment.
It's a loving environment. It's hard to live somewhere where it's not. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you for sharing those thoughts. Okay, so from some other seminars that we've run, people have said the same things that you've said, that there might be balance, peaceful and tranquil, when you just want to shut off from the world. There's a sense of ownership, your home is your castle, and Australians often talk about the great Australian dream, right? It's big in our culture to have your own home. Also freedom, I think we touched on that a little bit too. Another question for you. What things do you consider when you're shifting home or moving into a new home? So you want to move from where you are. What would be some of the things you might consider about a new place?
It's more suitable than the previous one.
More suitable.
For a reason.
Right, more suitable than the previous one. Yep.
Accessibility.
It's accessible. Yeah.
To
To family and friends.
Close to family and friends, or maybe away from family and friends. Yep.
Proximity to facilities like shops and
Right.
transport, that sort of stuff.
Closeness to transport, shops, it's very important. Particularly, if you don't use public transport, that might be even, you don't drive, that might be very important. Yeah. Affordability is a big question. Yeah. What can my budget afford? Other thoughts?
Just the environment around.
Okay.
Suburbs to rural.
Yeah, the environment. So if you're a city person, or you like to live in the suburbs or the burbs, as my niece says, or apparently there's a difference between living on the north and the south side of the Yarra, according to whichever side you live on, of course. Yeah. Okay, so some of these things we've mentioned: price, but it's close to work. It's hard to commute every day if you're, 1.5 hours away from where you work. What type of home? I've had like a reasonably big home, and I'm with a big garden, and I'm going, you know what, I'm over this. I'd really like to live in an apartment with no garden. So the type of home can be really important to people as well. The neighbourhood. Neighbourhoods are really important to people, where they live and whether they can feel like there's a good energy in a neighbourhood. Who with? You might be thinking about who you might want to live with. Like if you've got a small budget, you might be thinking, I really need to share, so I need a 2 or 3 bedroom home, those types of things. Okay, so who usually makes these decisions? The person who's moving. Well, we do, right. So decisions about home are made by us, our loved ones, and those we share with. That might seem fairly obvious, but it's not all that obvious if you've got a disability. Because you've got a whole host usually, and I think Janet will talk about this a bit more, of other people making decisions about everything that you spoke about for you.
Services are often in the business of finding accommodation for people with disabilities, but that is not the same as making home. And there's a really big difference, and there's some distortions that come out of that. When the business of making home is turned over to services, and often they get things really mixed up in their minds because they're trying to make a home for so many people at a time. And I think the benefit of families and the benefit of what we get to do is to think about home for one person at a time, one family at a time. And as Deb already pointed out, that's so unique and different from every single person. So with services and large groups of people thinking of making home for other large groups of people, there's some real distortions that bring us away from the kinds of thinking we talked about earlier. So the limit to vacancy, it's really typical for services to kind of build homes or find homes and then find the people to fit into them. And so, you're really starting from the other point of view. You're talking people into these roommates, or you're talking people into a suburban kind of area when they would prefer to live in the inner city. And so that really makes a difference in terms of your comfort and safety, and your feeling of the dream of home that you might have had in your head has to be severely compromised in order to fit into the housing that's available from a given service. And so secondly, it is that option to fit into. And even that happens in some pretty odd kinds of ways. I had a tour of a new apartment complex that was going up in a city. This was in Australia actually a few years ago, but the same thing could happen in Canada. And it was, nobody had moved in yet, and it was a pretty lovely mixed apartment building. And in the building, among 30 or 40 apartments, there were about 8 that were designed for people with disability. And we went into these 8 apartments, and every single one had every kind of accessibility device that you could think of. They had these flashing lights for people who couldn't hear, and would use that in case of fire. They had Braille everywhere. They had physical access into showers and everything. And they were so proud of these units. And I said, well, you don't even know who the people are and which of those features that they might find helpful or useful. They just had a generic disabled person in mind and made every kind of accommodation possible. So such an example of, you know, fitting into, taking a generic disabled person, which I've never met a creature like that, and fitting them into the housing. And certainly there's, you know, services end up, because they're thinking of many people at once, they end up congregating or bringing together people who share the same label, deficiency or disorder or whatever. And so all kinds of things end up happening there. In terms of getting to know your neighbors in your neighborhood, people just see the disability or the condition first, and they don't see the individual people. And that's a real barrier to kind of getting to know your neighbors and finding what good things you have in common and what interests you have in common. So grouping people together is often what's done. And I have been in Canada, you know, around people who have put together group homes, we call them, where 4 or 5 or 6 people might live together. And it's very common that those would be people, all the people there would have autism, or all the people would be seen to have severe behavioral disorders of some kind. It's really hard for neighbors in such a neighborhood to see those people one person at a time and as individuals. And then often in terms of housing, I'm going to talk to you in a little while about the kind of housing that a group of families I've been working with for 19 years in Canada, what they've come about building. And people often get so excited about the building that they haven't figured out the real magic to how people are living in their homes. And they've gone off and built a building that they think is somewhat like the one that I'm going to talk about. But what they do is they have maybe 50 apartments in a building, and 1/3 of them might be for people with disabilities, and 1/3 of them might be for seniors who require housing, and the final third might be for homeless people because they really need a home too, right? And people are just grouped together in such numbers that, again, it's really hard for people to look at that group of people and say they're kind of like me, but so it creates this real us and them mentality. So overall, when services design housing for lots of people at a time, there's all kinds of issues that come up that don't get really addressed, such as whose home is it? So I have a friend in Toronto, a woman that I've known for about 32 years now, a woman with a disability, and she lived for a long, long time in an apartment where she had slowly gotten to know her neighbors and knew people over time. And at some point in her life, they decided that, you know, she was 55 and almost a senior, which would really, and it would be better for her, you know, she was going to be failing soon anyways. And they moved her into a more supported housing option, they said, with 13 other people with disabilities. Right? And so the home that she thought was her home and she had control and she could be there as long as she was able was actually never her home that she had control over. They always had ultimate authority over when they would move her. And in many situations, even in apartments, the service are the ones who hold the lease and not the individuals themselves. Who makes the decisions in the home are the other things that really change. And there's all kinds of answers to this. You know, often I'm reminded of a time that I did work in a group living situation, and I was working with other staff people, and we were very excited because we decided everyone was going to get healthy. You know, focus on the we decided, right? So the staff decided everyone was going to get healthy. We took all of that sugary cereal out of the cupboards and stuffed it full of muesli and granola and other good stuff, and we really thought things were grand. And you know, after a while I left that place. I came back to visit, and another group of staff had another idea about what kind of breakfasts people should eat, and there was sugary cereal all over again. You know, so there was supposed to be a home for people, but who makes the decisions there? You know, that's always a key issue. I always do things like I listen in on people, even when I knock at people's the door of their home, and I'm listening for the support person to be saying things like, oh, there's a knock at the door. Brenda, are you going to get that or shall I? And those little things tell me the difference between whose home is it, who's making the decisions. Other kinds of distortions happen because we're looking at you know, is it, well, the person in the agency is the same kind of thing, but, you know, who's kind of taking other bigger decisions? And often people are left with decisions like, do you want apple juice or orange juice this morning? Or, you know, what are you going to wear today? But bigger decisions such as, you know, when you're upset, who leaves your home? Or who are the people you invite into your home? Or should you have some say in the supporters who come into your home? Those are much bigger decisions, much more decisions that impact on people's very lives, and those are often made by the agency themselves. Another group of factors around control is agencies often don't share the same definition of home. They're often thinking in terms of housing, accommodation. Some very clearly think in terms of beds and beds to be filled, which is such a different kind of set of criteria than we're talking about here. And often, you know, they just cannot get around to these kinds of things because these are things that you get to think of one person at a time rather than 40, 50, or whatever the group you're trying to find housing for. So at the very best, those kinds of options can be home-like rather than home themselves, but they tend to vary. They're home-like as long as you have staff in place who are focused on that happening, that staff leave, and something else can happen after them. And home really is actually more than a place to live. But for many people, where housing is planned for them, that's where they get to be when they're not in their day program or their work program. For many of us, a home is in fact the place we start off in the morning, and we might come to at various times throughout our day. We might do a part-time job and come back for a bit of a rest, or we prefer to eat lunch at home because we like the food that we have there. So for many of us, you know, it's much more than just a place to live, but it's a place to thrive, invite other people in, and really be a fuller place than that. Services and people who do kind of thinking of home on a larger scale often don't pay attention to the tension between is this a home or is this a place of work? So people who require support in their home, for the support workers, that home is actually a place of work. And there's some things that make your place of work a little bit easier. It's easier in your place of work if you've got maybe a telephone with a couple of extensions on it. If you've got your staff schedule up so you can see quickly who's coming in next. Where you've got the binders and papers and file folders in a filing cabinet and kind of organized. Where if you're working on teaching someone something, maybe you'll put that list up in the bathroom or up in the kitchen where the teaching is going to be happening. Those are all things that help someone in a work role find their work and do their work more easily. And they're exactly the opposite to what we think about as home. And if you're not conscious about that difference, you would just allow things to happen. When you're conscious that you want home to be in these ways, you find ways not to have a filing cabinet out in the middle of the living room. You find ways to put binders of information in private kinds of places and make sure that home comes through first. Often in service settings, rules and regulations are the norm over kind of hospitality and welcome. So walking in a person's home, there might be things like fire exits that are prominently displayed. There might be rules around food. I've been in places where the staff aren't allowed to sit and eat with the people because they haven't contributed to the food budget. Those kinds of odd kinds of rules. And that happens, again, when you're trying to make one set of rules for a whole group of people. In many of these places, there's often weird things that happen when ordinary things would do just as well. I know many places where I've walked into a bathroom and seen like a toothbrushing kind of breakdown of how to do this. We've found just over time, talking a person through some really good toothbrushing, doing some modeling and whatnot, which is invisible during the rest of the day to everyone, is just as effective as that list, which is typically more helpful for the staff person than it is for the person with a disability. Home is seen as a program rather than a way to live and a place to be, there's all kinds of things that are put in place that feel awkward and odd. Rules around kind of making your bed before you come down to breakfast. My kids would be in big trouble around our house with that rule, right? You know, so Michael Kendrick, who most of you know, often says, don't do something weird if something ordinary will do. And it's one of my favorite sayings. Right. Speaking of the devil, Michael, a quote from him is great, is a real home is not solely one's dwelling place, but rather a key crucible in life that helps sustain and uphold much that is deeply personal, private, and intimate about ourselves and reflects our deep identity, values, and preferences for a good life. And I think that's a great kind of note to end on, to keep us on track, not focused on the distortions, which I've just gone through, but making sure we kind of head into the kind of area that we do want to be in.